There's a strong empirical connection between technology, gains in productivity, which leads to economic growth, which leads to military power. So therefore, it's no surprise that governments, states always try to control technology, and specifically the dissemination of technology. So governments always try to control who gets which part of technology, because they know that from technology stems political power. Right now, we have zero processes, structures, frameworks for global cooperation. And that happens at a time when the planet is literally burning. I mean, where we really have to deal with climate change. And it's simply astonishing that we even consider now that putting solar panels and batteries, etc., are now threatened by export control. So we make clean technologies less available because we weaponize them in a global tech Cold War. The risk of a truly global world war, I think, is more. The biggest risk there is misunderstandings and miscommunications, like, something is happening in Taiwan and then it escalates from there. That's the biggest threat I see. So an unintentional escalation is the biggest threat with regard to a truly global war.
Thank you for joining Once Changing the World, India's first Future Tech Meets Sustainability podcast. Today, I'm delighted and honored to have with me Mr. Ansgar Baums, a prominent name in the world of tech and geopolitics. He's a senior advisor at Analytics, non-residential senior fellow at the Stimson Center, advises Sub-Erste Lesung. He's ex-Zoom, HP, SAP plus Bitkom, and has spent time at Germany's Office for the Protection of the Constitution. And he's the co-author of the new book, Tech Cold War, the Geopolitics of Technology. So Ansgar, really appreciate you taking time being part of the podcast. I think the world is completely changing, because earlier it was the arms race, and today I think all the nations are racing towards AI dominance. They're flexing their muscle, and most of them are treating artificial intelligence development as like a zero-sum game, because everybody knows it. There's America, there's blocking access of chips. And AI waits to a couple of countries. They also have the AI diffusion and export control policy. So at least from my perspective, I see clearly that we are somewhere at like a precipice of sorts. Because instead of going towards a collaboration, we are going towards conflict, and this could possibly lead to from a tech Cold War, it could just blow up into like a full-blown World War III. What I see is that the tech companies are racing towards building what they call artificial general intelligence, which seems to be the most important technology humanity will ever invent. While the governments at the European Union, they have like a very regulatory stance, and then some governments are still playing a catch-up game. So for someone who's been invested in the tech as well as the government side, how do you see this, and what would be your advice to people from the government who are listening?
Thanks for having me. Thanks for the question. Maybe starting with the observation that yes, indeed, we are entering a new phase, right? What political scientists call the unipolar moment has ended. So the global dominance of one world power after the end of the Cold War was basically also the environment in which digital technologies developed. So when the wall fell, when the Cold War ended, this was exactly the point in time when the internet became a global phenomenon. So arguably, the digital technology that we know so far is a child of a unipolar world order. And now that we move into a new world order, it's not exactly clear how it's going to look like. Maybe it's bipolar or bipolar-ish, who knows? It seems to be imminent that also technology is changing fundamentally. And what seemed to be, so we are used to technology being globally available, right? So you could use your iPhone anywhere in the world. You could connect to the internet anywhere, etc. pp. This might be also just an episode in history, simply because it was supported by a unipolar moment. now that we enter this new world, it might actually be the case that IT is splitting along geopolitical fault lines. That means that if the world is becoming bipolar, we might see two independent IT stacks that do not communicate with each other. And if you think this through, what this means is basically changes everything from a perspective of global scalability of products, of how IT companies set themselves up globally. Right now, they produce one product and try to sell it everywhere, anywhere in the world. That might all change when you only can run Chinese encryption-based products based on Chinese cartography in case of cars, based on Chinese compute architectures in China. Then you basically set up a completely different completely different product in China for China. So I think literally we are at the tipping point where the fundamentals of how IT looks like, of how we can use IT is basically happening as we speak. And that's the game changer. And yeah, governments are keen to control the dissemination of technology. That's also new, right? In the past, it was like, particularly the US government was very keen to promote access to technology worldwide because it perceived it was in their interest. Now you see the controls on NVIDIA chips, the controls on EUV machinery, on all kinds of technologies. So you see bans of Huawei, etc. So you see that governments are now ready and capable to intervene deeply in tech supply chains for geopolitical purposes. And again, that changes a lot for corporations who are basically not really used to that kind of treatment, and they're struggling mightily. So that's the new world. With regard to AI, it's a little bit early to tell how important it really is and how it's going to develop, right? So if you look at it from a long-term perspective as a historian, you probably have a couple of question marks there. Do not believe all the hype there is, but it is certainly perceived as a key technology. The problem, of course, is that AI is it's a general purpose technology, right? So it's difficult to tell what part of the code is civil and which part is military relevant. And since that is difficult to distinguish, we now see a situation where basically access to LLMs in general is restricted for geopolitical purposes. And you can already see that the ecosystem that's developing in China with regard to AI will be trained on different data, will have different governance structures around it, will basically be developed independently from Western AI. And that's a very interesting development, as I said, because that clearly shows how the split of the IT world is accelerating.
We live in a hyper connected world, and the hope was, the dissemination of technology is going to spread across the world. We are going from unipolar to maybe a bipolar to a multipolar world, because the world has completely changed. The dynamics of the internet, I think, has made knowledge accessible for everyone. And then what maybe was uh, something that only like one of the powerful nation could do right now is in the open world. Though there are still, like, we still are siloed. We still, I think, the development of tech is still closed. I hope that we go more towards an open world, where tech is for everyone. And you mentioned about the use of technology, the militarization of technology, and obviously AI. And I think that's plain to see through, even like the wars that's ongoing, with the Russia Ukraine war, and that's Ukraine, a small country, and they're using technology, they're using drones, and they're destroying their multi-million dollars tanks of Russia. So I think slowly and steadily, I think this is going to impact government, the way military functions, businesses, and also the common man. I want to get into that, but before I get into that, I want to talk about Synolytics, because you're part of Synolytics, and your firm specializes in China focused strategy consulting. But I would love to get your perspective on the overview of China, the pros and cons of China, and how they've managed to kind of grow so rapidly in such a small time, and obviously your firm, Syneretics.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Complex topic, right? First of all, I think China is much more diverse, complicated, interesting than many people think. Particularly what I found in the US and in Europe, we often discuss a kind of a caricature of China, as if China would be this top-down pyramid of a society where the president is on top and basically pulls all the strings and knows everything and controls everything, right? China is much more diverse, chaotic, anarchical almost in some sense. So it's a fascinating topic. First, I'd say, if you look at the history of China, a couple of things stand out. One is that the sense that technology is key and mastering technology is key to the progress and the coherence of the nation, the existence of the nation has been there from the start. So if you look at, particularly now with the current government form, Mao already announced in speeches that mastering technology is key to keep the Communist Party in charge and in power. So it's a nation that understood from the beginning, and even with the four big inventions, etc. It's a strong narrative in China that you can almost say there is this techno-nationalism is part of the DNA of this country. So it shouldn't be a surprise that China is very much focused on technology in order to secure its sovereignty, independence, and to project power. Right? That's something deeply ingrained in the Chinese political culture. That's number one. Number two is the tech sector in China is quite outstanding because it's this mix of large government-owned, state-owned enterprises, often a little bit sluggish, but then you also have these big tech champions like absolute world-class tech companies like Huawei, Tencent, Beidou, etc., DJI, etc. And then you have this gazillions of anarchical startups and who try to become the next big thing. This is a very chaotic environment, and it's Darwinist, right? So only the strong survive. So there's a lot of dynamic. It's often bottom up. It's often triggered by investments, not of the central government, but of the state, of the provinces' governments who have their own economic agenda, try to establish clusters of companies, etc. So they compete against each other, right? So there's a lot of dynamics in the system, and it has shown remarkable results. So it's I think even the Communist Party was surprised by what DeepSeek had done, right? They came out of nowhere. It wasn't a top-down plan that the KPC said, this startup there should grow, etc. It wasn't planned. It just happened. And that shows how much energy there is. And from the foundations, it's just an extraordinary base of people who are well educated in STEM. They also have the workforce to actually produce stuff, to manufacture high-end devices. So it's quite an impressive place to do business. And many global companies, from Apple to car manufacturers and beyond, found that it is very difficult to replace China in your value chain because it's partly it's world-class in manufacturing. The downside, of course, is over the last years, President Xi has clearly prioritized control and security over growth, right? So whenever there was a choice to be made, he pivoted towards control. He basically destroyed a whole tech sector in China, education technologies. He basically decapitated one of the main IT player companies in China when Jack Ma was disappearing after a speech critical of financial regulation in China, and he sent a clear signal, right? You can grow, but once you cross a line and you step into our territory, then you're gonna be axed. And growth numbers under Xi have become a problem, and as he prioritized his control agenda. And the big question now is for the future is, if China grows at this rate, can it avoid the feared middle income trap? So can it really jump across this moat that you have there? So it's difficult to get from low-end manufacturing, being low-end manufacturing, really to high value-added economy. And this is, I think, where China is currently has to solve for. So in that sense, China has no time to lose to get back on a growth track. For growth, it needs global stability. So I think that's exactly the position that China is right now in. It needs to carefully balance between confrontation and cooperation in order to maintain growth. So Xi, to a degree, is also hemmed in. He's not completely free to act, right? I think we underestimate how much constraints even a President Xi faces if he takes his decisions. He needs to somewhat align control agenda with the need for growth, and growth requires freedom. And that's, I think, the big puzzle that China needs to solve for itself. On a national security perspective, I think the big question is, of course, like, what does China want in the long run? I think it wants to establish itself as a regional hegemon in the adjacent seas and territories to its. I don't see a global domination agenda. I haven't found a single document or statement where even the most radical Chinese nationalist would claim that they would replace the US on a global scale. This is not how they think about themselves. China historically has always been the dominant power in the region. And I think this is the natural aspiration of this country. And of course, these ambitions collide with the US agenda, specifically around Taiwan. And this is probably the most dangerous spot in the world right now. And it's particularly unnerving because we are in this transition phase, right? The most dangerous phases in history are when the old world order is gone, but the new is not emerged yet. And in this confusion in between, this is when usually bad stuff happens. So I take the risks around Taiwan very seriously, particularly because, as we know, things happen. Imagine two military ships collide by incident and stuff gets out of control because no one can backtrack. These scenarios I take very seriously. Looking back in history, it's just a dangerous transition phase that we are currently in.
I want to talk about this dangerous transition phase, but before that, the DeepSeek moment, so what I see that at least here in India, the students in the cities, I mean, because they've got all the privilege, they are okay, but the students from the rural areas, they are the ones who are excelling, because I guess when they don't have resources, they find ways around to kind of innovate. And I think that's the same thing which happened with DeepSeek. I mean, the US tried to push China at a corner and then didn't realize that obviously there are other ways, and there'll always be ways. I mean, when you push someone, they will find a way to innovate. Through history, if you've seen like the world wars, the 1 and 2, when European empire kind of declined, and then United States and Soviet Union, emerged, most powerful nations globally. And then the end of the Cold War, the US unipolarity, the Soviet Union collapsed. So these historical power transition, like you mentioned, it's chaotic, and it gives. I mean, there will be a lot of problem. How do you see this transitioning, with maybe in the next few years, you like you said, I mean, though maybe in China there's nobody who's looking at like maybe like a global domination, but maybe America sees it that way. This transition, do you think is going to be an easy transition, when we move from maybe possibly this unipolar world that we currently live into, maybe like a bipolar, or possibly like a multipolar world also, because there is like maybe India over there also kind of, doing everything, trying to, be in the race or being relevant, when it comes to building exponential tech?
I mean, first on innovation, I think you described it exactly right. So what is innovation? It's an answer to a question. It's a solution to a problem, right? So you innovate when you have to solve for something. And this is exactly what the DeepSeek moment was. You had a constraint on compute power because of export controls, and the response to this constraint was focusing on doing things smarter than rather doing things with more compute power. So in that sense, I would always say, be careful which kind of artificial constraints you create, because your opponent will basically then, you give an opponent a reason for innovation, right? And I think people understand this intuitively. as you said, it's something where you can observe anywhere in life. That constraint can actually be a good thing, right? But it seems to be forgotten lesson when you look at how export controls have been designed. So I'm not a fan of these export controls. I think they don't work. We basically gave China a good reason to innovate, and DeepSeek is the proof for this. Yeah, I mean, the transition from one global order to another. As I said, it's the most dangerous part of it. It's also a problem because right now we do not have any way to cooperate on global issues. So if you compare, just take the matter of vaccines against pandemics. During the Cold War in the 50s and 60s, the Soviet Union and the US could agree on a global vaccine campaign against polio, right? So there was this high-level cooperation, like they were competing in geopolitical terms, but still they recognized, we can agree on cooperation on fighting pandemics in the third world or in the global south. Right now, we cannot even agree on that. If you look at the vaccine situation during COVID, even vaccines became super political, and there was lots of this kind of they take the Chinese vaccine, this is a sign for their global allegiance, blah blah blah, and we don't, it was kind of a complete nightmare from a pandemic, how to fight a pandemic perspective. So it means right now we have zero processes, structures, frameworks for global cooperation. And that happens at a time when the planet is literally burning. I mean, where we really have to deal with climate change. And it's simply astonishing that we even consider now that putting solar panels and batteries, etc., are now threatened by export controls. So we make clean technologies less available because we weaponize them in a global tech Cold War. It's ridiculous, and it's very threatening, right? So what I'm concerned about is that during this transition phase, when neither the US nor China nor anyone else is really in the driver's seat of triggering global cooperation, we are just losing the time that we have left in order to come to meaningful global cooperation on how to fight climate change. What happens if there's a next pandemic? I mean, we are in a really bad shape as a global society to prevent stuff from that escalating, right? So from that sense, I think the dangerous part is literally we're not good or well organized in moments of transitions, and that can easily take a high toll. Then question is, how do you get to a new world order, right? I think what is key is Kevin Rudd, the former Prime Minister of Australia, has put it very well. He basically said, we need to distinguish three different things. First is we need to prevent that our red lines are overlapping and we basically escalate into a hot war. That's basically about Taiwan, right? So how do you contain the Taiwan threat? How do you establish connectivity between the military leaderships that they can, de-escalate, etc., pp, that kind of stuff. So hot crisis prevention management is bucket number one. Bucket number two is, yes, you will compete. You will compete economically, technically, etc., pp. That's basically consuming a lot of attention, of course. That's fine as long as it's somewhat doesn't escalate from there on. The third bucket is we need a space for this collaboration and cooperation globally. And we somewhat need to organize a system where all three things are possible and are not completely destructive. That's for me the benchmark for a new world order. And if it's bipolar or bipolar-ish or multipolar, that's something you can only observe, not really influence. But I'd say a new world order is successful if it establishes these three different buckets, and we basically have ways to prevent escalation, and we have ways to actually collaborate despite competition.
I so very hope that we transition into this new world order peacefully. But I am not so very convinced because how we humans function. I think we are self-preserving creatures, and capitalism has always been the sort of like the engine which drives the planet, and I mean almost all nations are trying to build these tech stack which is going to give them undue advantage. That's what the nations know, because it gives you an advantage over the other. But I really, really hope that we transition from this unipolar to whether bipolar or multipolar in a very, very peaceful way. Tech Cold War, your book. Will be great if you could give us an overview of the book and which trends or development were the most alarming to you while you were researching or writing the book.
Okay. So our book basically goes back to the experience that my co-author Nicholas Butts and I had when we worked for HP. So we were responsible for managing geopolitical risks for HP. We were, HP is a hardware company with lots of production manufacturing in China, IP development mostly in the US and beyond. So we were in the middle of the whole first Trump administration tariff escalation. And we started to think about the topic more systematically. We both are, by training, political scientists with focus on international relations, and we felt that it's now becoming very clear how international relations, foreign policy dynamics are influencing more and more technology. And we felt that there is this lack of understanding how deep basically the connection between geopolitics and technology always has been and will become again. The problem is we forgot how deep this connection is during this unipolar moment, right? We were victims to this, basically we perceived something as global and final, which was basically unipolar and transitional. It goes very much back to the end of history hypothesis, right? So I think that's interesting because it's so much more prevalent in Europe and in the US that we perceived like after 1990, basically world history has ended. And from now on, everybody will be a liberal democracy and embrace capitalism, right? That was a strong belief system. And therefore, we didn't care much about historical dynamics anymore, and we didn't care about trying to understand, geopolitics. I think the perspectives, of course, in Asia Pacific has always been completely different, right? For Asia Pacific, 1990 was not that much of a turning point, right? It was a completely different experience. So to a certain degree, I think that people in Asia Pacific are much more capable of understanding the new world than we are in Europe, right? We're still caught in our post 1990 moment world, and it's hard to change your mindset on this. So we wrote this book basically to try to help to change the mindset. So what we do is basically in the first plot we reflect generally on the relationship between geopolitics and technology, and it's very interesting because in the end. There's a strong empirical connection between technology, gains in productivity, which leads to economic growth, which leads to military power. Right? This is the line of causation. So therefore, it's no surprise that governments, states always try to control technology, and specifically the dissemination of technology. So the Assyrians tried to control the dissemination of their war chariots, right? The Carolingians in Europe in the 9th century tried to control the dissemination of very well-made swords, where they had the technology and they try to prevent that their enemies get these technologies, right? So governments always try to control who gets which part of technology because they know that from technology stems political power. At the same time, vice versa, we also see that technology is basically therefore the biggest change agent in geopolitics, right? So if you think about geopolitics, why does geopolitics change at all is a very complicated question, right? And we argue that if it wasn't for technology and the changes that technology is triggering, geopolitics would be very static. It wouldn't change that much at all because demographics is a very slow-moving factor. Geology doesn't move at all or very, very slow. So there's no reason why geopolitics should change if it wasn't for new inventions of technology, which brings new imbalances. And then, dynamics are created that change the global the global balance of power. So that's how we try to explain how deeply connected technology and geopolitics are. And therefore, the conclusion is it shouldn't be a surprise to us that geopolitics is now fundamentally influencing technology again, and all these controls that we discussed, export controls, etc., are now front and center of what we call geotech statecraft. So the idea that you can use global tech value chains in order to achieve your geopolitical goals. And in the book, we describe how this geotech statecraft is basically a long catalog of policy instruments, export controls, investment controls, import controls, etc. How these geotech statecraft tools have been developed over the last 15 years, basically. And we then we ask the question, okay, if that's all happening, what does it do to technology? And then we're back to this idea of the split IT stack. Because the natural reaction of China to the weaponization of all these technologies by the US is to become less dependent. So China is absolutely prioritizing to minimize dependency on US technology. And that will basically go all the way on the application level. It's already completely split, right? So there's almost zero applications on a Chinese iPhone that you would find on a US iPhone, but it will now go all the way down to the semiconductor level. So we think that in the future there will be Chinese compute architectures that are not reliant on Western intellectual property. So there will be something other than an x86 or an ARM chip that will empower Chinese devices. On the operating system level, we already see that when Huawei was cut off Android in 2019, Huawei has developed its own operating system called Harmony OS that now will become the foundational operating system for anything connected, be it from all the way from small Internet of Things devices to even PCs. So in that sense, geopolitics is imprinting itself on technology on a very fundamental level. And in the last part of the book, we discuss how companies are actually reacting to this. So what do companies do? Companies do not act according to a geopolitical agenda. They are pragmatists, right? And we discuss how corporations are trying to mitigate the impact of these interferences and change their structures, change their corporate structure, change how they operate in China. Often to the surprise of politicians, they do not disinvest from China necessarily. Often they actually double down on China and invest more in order to be part of this new developing Chinese IT stack. That's basically the story of the book. So, and it's a story of, we think that politics and enterprises are not reading each other very well, right? There's a lot of misunderstanding, and it's a new development that you have this friction, right? In the past, what was good for U.S. companies was, good for America. That was the assumption. So the U.S. government was very supportive of expansion of U.S. tech in the world. This has completely changed now with all these controls. You have on the one side this government keen to restrict access to technology, and on the other side you have companies who are still willing to sell globally. They want to sell globally. So there's a conflict now happening in DC that we haven't had before. And we wrote this book in context of this new conflict between US tech companies on the one side, committed to global markets, versus a US government trying to restrict exactly the dissemination of these technologies.
Right. Yeah, I hope the world changes. And you mentioned about, I think forever, I think humans were in a linear trajectory, and then came in technology, and this, started with Moore's law, with these chips, and now I think it's this sort of convergence of technology. It's not just artificial intelligence. There is the immersive tech stack, which is the augmented reality, virtual reality, mixed reality stack. Then there is nanotech, there's biotech, there's quantum computing, and I somehow see that all of these tech stack is accelerating at the speed of light. And I think there is very little understanding of when and how this technology could maybe just go out of hand. So yes, I think there should be more. I hope I'm sure the book will add like clear the haziness and bring in more clarity for enterprise and geopolitics, how this coexists, and how you can understand and create a better future. Uh, your chapter 3, you mentioned, you write about the prelude to the tech cold war, and I think till 2013, till the Snowden leak, I think business was as usual, globally. That there was, even China, it was an open ecosystem, and then they kind of built that great Chinese firewall. You write about this, disillusionments, the Snowden affair, and the great Chinese firewall. Can you explain this to my audience, please?
Sure. So when China entered the WTO, negotiated under Bill Clinton, there was this great hope that wherever the mobile phone goes, democracy will follow. Right? There was this strong sense of once you connect and you open up your society to the internet and information is globally accessible, then basically autocracies will fall. And of course, as we know now, this was a big illusion. China actually managed to build by trial and error and with lots of, costs, achieved to establish a control infrastructure that goes very, very deep and basically has shown that the internet does not have to be global, that you can basically compartmentalize it and that you can make access to all kinds of informations very, very difficult, at least for 99% of the people. Of course, there will always be, people very skilled with technology who can circumvent it, but and even as people use VPNs or whatever, but it's becoming cumbersome, and in the end, it's a de facto split of the internet that happened. That was surprise number one. For the rest of the world, it was rather, I think, a surprise that the supposed neutral status of the internet was basically also a little bit of a fantasy. And that was the Snowden revelation, right? When it became clear that the supposed global infrastructure was compromised by U.S. Intelligence gathering, where U.S. companies were forced to cooperate to a certain extent. We always knew that there was lawful access in every country, right? Every country has its national security rules on how much telecommunications data is supposed to be submitted. But I think what just shocked the world was the scale of the intelligence gathering that happened in the background. Often the Snowden moment was a reckoning in the sense of a global infrastructure as the internet is not neutral. There are power, uneven power distributions within this infrastructure, and the reckoning that something needs, you need to be careful, you need to rebalance, you need to minimize your dependencies, has become since then a major concern even for close US allies. In Europe, the term technological sovereignty was historically mainly directed against influence of the US, again, not China or Russia. So you can see how big the disappointment basically was that the internet could be weaponized in that sense.
You mentioned earlier in the course of the conversation, we are already going through a couple of issues. The world is going through a couple of issues. There's climate crisis, there's geopolitical tensions. There's currently, India and Pakistan as loggerheads. There is so many. I think there's North Korea, South Korea. There is Israel, Palestine, Sudan. There is so many problems, and I think we as a world, I hope that we take these problems out and let everyone live in peace. But that's too idealistic, and I don't really know whether something like this can ever happen. But yes, the world today, I think there are the people who kind of hold the technology, especially US, with the chips and everything. There is a kind of push, where there's restrictions on chips. Then the Taiwan, which is the production hub of semiconductor chips. There is a geopolitical issue over there between China and US. Do you worry that these signals this mentioned could lead from a cold war to a hot war, or are there other scenarios which could escalate this cold war into a hot war?
I mean, sure, as I mentioned, the transition phase from one world order to another is the most dangerous one, right? That's just an historical observation. A second historical observation, you might have heard about it, which is currently discussed a lot, is the so-called Thucydides trap. So goes back to the Greek historian Thucydides, who described the dynamics between Athens and Sparta, 4th century before Christ, and how they developed into a war. And the observation is, if there's a hegemon, a dominant power, which is challenged by a rising power, the risk of war is increasing. And historically, like Allison, the Graham Allison of Harvard University did a study about it, and he counted basically situations where this was the case. Like you have the hegemon and the challenger, and I think in 15 or in 11 out of 15 times, this situation led to a hot war. And this is then called the Thucydides trap. So how to avoid it? So let's say structurally speaking, we live in very dangerous times. No doubt about it. On the other side, of course, we live in a time where we have nuclear deterrence. We live in different times than, let's say, in the beginning of the First World War. But still, I'm concerned, and I think there are different levels of risks. I mean, the risk of a truly global world war, I think, is more. The biggest risk there is misunderstandings and miscommunications. Like something is happening in Taiwan, and then it escalates from there. That's the biggest threat I see. It's so an unintentional escalation is the biggest threat with regard to a truly global war. That's number one. Number two, of course, is we do not have anyone who is enforcing a global order in a certain way, or someone who's able to mitigate if regional conflicts arise, right? So we're basically back to a world order where conflict is not easily contained because you don't have the top dog like the US who will send a fleet to make sure everybody cools down. So in that sense, I think additional risk to world peace is simply that regional conflicts might simmer for longer and are not managed properly and are not mitigated. So I mean, look at the situation with Pakistan and in India right now. In the past, you probably would have seen much more involvement of the US trying to bring both sides to the table again and de-escalate. Right now, the US couldn't care less, right? I mean, I don't see any engagement there. So the risk is then that in comparison to past short-term escalations between India and Pakistan, it might actually go on for longer simply because there is no restraint anymore. So that's a second order geopolitical risks that I see. And then, as I said, repeating myself, the third order geopolitical risk, of course, is, if there's something happening like the next pandemic, how do we organize global cooperation? If US and China do not talk to each other and distrust each other, it will be very, very difficult to organize a global response to a global challenge, including climate change. So these are the three risk levels that I see. So it's not a great, let's say, optimistic picture here. I fear. I think the best we can do is to recognize how big the risks are. And hopefully everybody is treating carefully and is recognizing that stuff like elections matter, right? It matters who is in power in situations like this. If you have an idiot in charge, he will make the wrong decisions in the next crisis situation. So that stuff really, really matters. So we don't have the luxury that we had, 15 years ago. You might argue it doesn't really matter who's at head of state because, the world was boring. Not much happened. But in these times, it really matters who is in charge. So be careful who you elect. Yeah? Be careful you do not elect someone you only elect for protest because you don't like established governments or whatever. It might really have severe consequences. So I think we all need to become more serious persons again by recognizing the threats that we face.
True. And at least what I see is that nations, I mean, the people I think who are voting they're voting jingoistic leaders. I mean, that's plain to see in all countries, including mine. So you recently analyzed, President Trump's first 100 days in office. What policies has his administration implemented that most significantly impacted the global technology landscape?
I mean, for sure, the tariffs, right? So in comparison to the Biden administration, Trump is much more focusing on the tariffs again, right? Biden was much more about export controls, new ways of doing entity bans, etc. pp. With the current tariff rates announced against China, but also against countries like Vietnam or Malaysia, which would be the natural, or India for that matter, would be the natural second source countries for manufacturing. With all of these tariffs, we basically face an unprecedented disruption of tech supply chains on a structural level. And that could lead to a complete change of the long-term trends in IT. I mean, we are used to that IT is becoming cheaper, right? That's basically what we also, take as a given, Moore's law and stuff like that. Actually, we might see that we at the end of this trend. So IT might become more expensive again because of all this disruption. Imagine, your MacBook doesn't cost you $1,300 in the future, but it will cost you $3,500. What does this do to you, like your consumption patterns? But also, what does this mean for education, for e-education, for people relying on digital means to educate themselves? What does this mean for health? What does it mean for general welfare? So I think there are a couple of really problematic results of such a tariff policy, including inflation. Right? IT has also been a deflationary factor globally. So we know that because IT is making things more transparent, cheaper, less inventory, more efficiency. IT has been a deflationary force in the past, and we might actually reverse that trend right now. And so lots to contemplate what this actually means, what we're currently looking at with these tariffs. I take them rather seriously. No matter how they are now implemented in detail, I think what has certainly taken a big hit is the trust in the US and in US economic policy making. So I think the recognition that the US is no longer committed to free trade will have long-term consequences for corporations worldwide.
Ansgar, my last question to you, wanted to end on a constructive note, not so much negative because of this. What positive technological breakthroughs do you believe offer the most promise for addressing humanity's greatest challenges?
Yeah, good question. I think fusion energy will be top of my list. I think we desperately need other energy sources, and particularly I can only speak from a German perspective. Germany has an energy dependency problem since 1890, right? When the world economy moved from steam to petrol engines, we had lots of coal in Germany, but no oil or gas. So since then, Germany is dependent on someone else to provide its energy supplies. And that's structurally a problem, right? And India is basically in the same situation, right? You do not have energy dependency, and the energy you have is very dirty, right? So coal is a real problem also for health of people in India. There's still too much coal plants online in India, and India has decided to actually double down on coal for geopolitical reasons, right? So we have the same problem everywhere, and I think in that situation, it's desperately needed is energy sources that enables us to produce clean energy and also manage our dependencies in a different way. I think fusion energy is a big opportunity here. So I wish there would be more attention, investments, and more this kind of it's lingering this development. There's progress, but it's slow. I wish there would be this kind of splurge of money into this research sector and the urgency that will then inevitably lead to the breakthroughs that we need. So that, I think, would be my biggest hope in the tech space, how tech could really help us save the planet.
Right. Ansgar, thank you so much for taking time and being part of the podcast. I think we are living in the most fantastic time in human history. It's just that maybe we need to relook at maybe not just holding it for, I mean, whatever we get only for ourselves. I think we need to understand this world when we humans, whenever we came the evolution, this world was one open big plot of land, and then some smart person said, okay, let's kind of figure out, how do we get a bigger plot of land, and they started creating these borders and countries, and then another smart guy said, oh, the only way to run these guys is, I mean, everyone is rule them, is maybe we get some doctrine in. How about getting in some religion? Then came in religion, and then came in, like, okay, a business. They realized that, oh wow, I can be like really really rich. And then came in money, which was top down, run by banks, and then came in politics, and so on and so forth. And I think we have gone so far away from understanding the core of who we are. We are one race, one people, living in a beautiful blue dot, which is insignificant in this entire universe. And it's only way we can make it significant is if we together come together and create a better world and unite rather than divide. Because I think when we go towards collaboration is the only way where the entire world benefits, not conflict. And today I see that the world is going towards conflict when we are in the cusp of possibly maybe inventing the best technology we could, I mean, a tool that humanity has ever created, a self-learning technology, or maybe like another species of sorts, which is maybe like us, or maybe diverges into something like really really beautiful. But yes, I think it really depends upon us to take that stance. So thank you once again for taking time and being part of the podcast. I'm going to leave behind the link of your book, which I urge my readers to kind of purchase, because it's a beautiful book. So thank you once again to my listeners. If you like what you see in here, then please press the subscribe button. Until next time, thank you, Ansgar. Really really appreciate this.
Thank you.
Thank you.